The drafting table had become my entire world, a rectangular island of white paper and graphite dust in a sea of midnight shadows. I sat there, face onto the challenge, looking exhausted but completely focused on the physics of the impossible. My hand moved with a steady, rhythmic precision, drawing a complex structural line with my silver mechanical pencil. This wasn't just a sketch, it was a vow of stability, a promise that this tower would never, ever falter. I looked through the rainy glass of my office window at the Aura Tower in the distance. It was glowing with 1,000 office lights, a skeletal giant of steel and hope rising high above the city's concrete heart. Then there was Victor Sterling. He stood in his sharp, charcoal gray suit, looking at the scale model of my masterpiece. To him, it wasn't a feat of engineering, it was just a pile of untapped profit waiting to be harvested. Victor stood before the digital wall screen, pointing aggressively at the budget spreadsheets. His voice was a serrated blade, cutting through my logic as he demanded we slash the costs of the very things that kept the building standing. I watched in silent horror as he took the digital pen and drew a thick red X over the blueprint section labeled Safety Core. With one movement, he had just signed the death warrant for the tower's structural integrity. He leaned over his polished glass desk, his face contorted in a shout that was reflected in the dark surface below. He called me an overpaid artist, claiming that my dedication to safety was nothing more than an expensive, useless paranoia. The air in the room turned cold as a security guard stepped forward, placing a heavy, firm hand on my shoulder. It was the silent, brutal signal that my tenure at my own creation had come to a violent end. I looked down at my workstation to see the words, "Access Revoked," blinking in bold, hateful red letters. My credentials, my files, and my years of work were being scrubbed from the system before I could even draw breath. I stood on the sidewalk and watched as a worker used a razor blade to scrape my name off the glass office door. The letters fell like dead leaves, leaving nothing behind but a smear of glue and a hollow silence. I walked into my small, dark apartment carrying a single box of my life's belongings. The shadows felt heavy as I set it down, the silence of the room a stark contrast to the buzzing energy of the firm I lost. I sat in the dark, my eyes reflecting the shifting colors of a digital weather map on my laptop. I wasn't looking at blueprints anymore, I was tracking the atmospheric pressures, waiting for the wind that I knew was coming. Outside, under the cold light of a full moon, the construction cranes continued their work on the tower. They were finishing Victor's hollowed-out version of my dream, blissfully unaware of the missing heart within the steel cage they built. I lived on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by old blueprints and countless empty coffee cups. I was a ghost haunting my own life, tracing the flaws in the Aura Tower's design over and over in the dim light. Deep within the concrete bowels of the tower, the liquid core cylinder sat abandoned and dry. Its chrome surface, once meant to be filled with life-saving polymer, was now slowly becoming covered in white, crusty, salt-like crystals of neglect. The barometer needle on my wall finally began to dip, sliding slowly into the storm zone. I felt the pressure change in my chest, a physical warning that the atmosphere was finally ready to test Victor Sterling's cheap ego. The storm hit with a primal fury, and the top of the Aura Tower began to sway violently against a dark, purple sky. It cut through the lashing rain like a desperate hand reaching for a balance it no longer possessed. My fingers flew across the laptop keys as I accessed the hidden sensors I had left behind. The screen flashed a terrifying message in the darkness: Cornerstone Dynamics, fail. The building was finally screaming under the weight of the wind. At the grand opening gala, the guests in their expensive tuxedos and gowns began to look at the ceiling with growing worry. They felt the floor shift beneath their feet, a subtle, sickening movement that shouldn't have been possible. The massive crystal chandeliers began to shake, tinkling like 1,000 funeral bells in the silence of the ballroom. The sound was high and sharp, a delicate warning of the catastrophic forces beginning to pull at the tower's seams. A glass of champagne sat on a nearby table, the golden liquid vibrating in perfect, concentric rings. Each ripple was a heartbeat of the storm, a visual representation of the energy the building could no longer absorb or dissipate. Victor Sterling stood alone by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the dark, lashing rain. For the first time, the arrogance was gone from his face, replaced by an icy terror as he felt the glass tremble against his palm. A sound like a gunshot echoed through the luxury penthouse as a large crack suddenly appeared in a concrete support pillar. The building was fracturing, its skeleton beginning to snap under the weight of Victor's greed and my absence. I sat calmly in my apartment, watching a digital simulation of the tower's stress points on my monitor. I knew the exact second it would fail, and I watched the red zones expand across the model like a spreading fire. Then my smartphone screen lit up the room, vibrating with a frantic energy. The caller ID flashed, incoming call, Victor Sterling. The man who had destroyed my career was finally calling to ask for his life back. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the chaos of the storm in the background. I looked out at the distant city lights, my voice calm and low as I told Victor that safety always had a price. Victor was no longer the titan of industry. He was huddled in a corner of the penthouse, holding his head in his hands. He was crying, begging for a fix that he had once called an expensive paranoia. The laptop screen chimed, flashing a notification, wire transfer, $10 million successful. It was the exact amount he had cut from the budget, returned to me in a moment of pure, desperate survival. My finger hovered over the send button on my glowing keyboard. I was the bridge between a billionaire's empire and a pile of glass and rubble. With one deliberate movement, I initiated the emergency code. Miles away, a heavy valve in the core room turned automatically. A pressurized blue dampening liquid rushed into the empty chrome cylinder, filling the void and providing the building with the counterweight it so desperately needed. The tower gave a massive audible sigh of movement. It leaned into the wind, shifting its massive weight with a grace it had almost lost, and finally found its balance against the hammer blows of the storm. The gala guests collapsed onto the floor, pale and shaking with relief as the vibration finally stopped. They looked around at the ruined luxury, realized how close they had come to the end, and began to weep. On the facade of the building, a single window panel had cracked into a perfect spiderweb. It was the only visible scar of the battle, a reminder of the stress that had nearly brought the entire structure down. Victor Sterling was led away by paramedics, his sharp suit wrinkled and his spirit utterly broken. He looked like a hollow shell of a man, stripped of his power and his pride by the very building he tried to cheat. Within the week, a for sale sign was hammered into the ground in front of Victor's luxury penthouse. The empire was being liquidated, piece by piece, as the legal and structural audits began to tear his legacy apart. I walked away from the city, finding myself standing on a quiet, grassy hill far from the steel and glass. I looked at a small stone house, a building that didn't need a core dampener to stay standing. I knelt down and began to plant a tree in the fresh, dark soil. It was a simple act of creation, a way to put down roots in a place where the air was clean and the ground didn't shake. I unrolled a new set of blueprints on a wooden table, but these were different. They were made of wood and heart, designed for a community center where people would come together, not be looked down upon. I looked at the distant city skyline as the sun began to set. The Aura Tower was just a tiny needle on the horizon, a reminder of a life I had left behind for something much more meaningful. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in decades. The silence of the hills was a melody compared to the screaming winds of the tower, and for the first time I was truly free. I closed my simple wooden journal, the cover worn and familiar in my hands. I had documented the rise and fall of my greatest work, and now I was ready to start a new chapter. I smiled to myself, the light of the setting sun warming my face. I knew that while a building can be stolen and a name can be erased, the truth of the architect always stays standing in the end. Victor Sterling thought he could build an empire on greed, but he forgot that a tower is only as strong as its foundation. In the end, the skyscraper still stands, but Victor is nothing more than a memory in a sharp suit. If you believe the architect was right to wait for the storm to prove his point, smash that like button. If you want to see more stories of the quiet builders winning against the arrogant bosses, hit subscribe and join our community of creators. Thanks for watching the Aura Towers journey. I'll see you in the next one.